In 1071, the Byzantines fought and lost a disastrous battle at Manzikert in modern-day Turkey. The emperor and his court could feel the noose tightening around their neck. This setback would go on to set the stage for the coming of the First Crusade. With this defeat at Manzikert, the Byzantines were pushed back each year, further and further into their own homeland. The triumphant Seljuk Turks pressed forth, keen to rid themselves of the Byzantines and their control over the Anatolian heartland. This advance threatened to topple the very center of Byzantine rule in the region, Constantinople, the great city of Rome that had long weathered mighty attacks and long-lasting sieges against the armies of Islam and many others. All had broken before its near impenetrable walls. However, with the near total loss of Anatolia, the inability to take pilgrimage to the Holy Land, the Byzantines grew increasingly desperate. Alexius I, Emperor of Byzantium, sought aid from the last place he wanted it, the Latin Western lands and the Pope of Rome. In the West, Pope Urban II had problems of his own. Near constant infighting had led to instability in the kingdoms of Western Europe. Seeing the chance to solve his domestic issues while gaining enormous power and prestige, the Pope spoke at the Council of Clermont in 1095. Here, a call to arms went out, seeking to reclaim the Holy Land from Islamic control and establish a kingdom of Jerusalem. Urban could never have predicted the events that would follow. He quickly lost control of the situation as word spread throughout the West like wildfire, especially in France. Here, zealous fervor and the promise of spiritual salvation led the ranks of the willing volunteers to surge forward. So rabid was the support for the cause of reclaiming the Holy Land that a massive army of ordinary peasants began to gather, intent on heading straight away east. The People's Crusade, led by Peter the Hermit, swelled to 100,000 unskilled fighters. This angry, armed mob even consisted of women and children. By the summer of 1096, the People's Crusade marched through France and into Germany. The thinking was simple: kill and destroy all the enemies of Christendom, even those close to home. Jews were massacred or forced to convert to Christianity as the crusade continued east. Modern estimates are between 4,000 to 8,000 Jews were killed during this pogrom, nearly a quarter to one-third of the entirety of the Jewish population of Europe in that time frame. While the nobility and clergy would go on to condemn these killings, they happened nevertheless. When this massive armed gang arrived outside of Constantinople's walls, Alexius ferried them over the Bosphorus by the 6th of August, anxious to be rid of them as fast as possible. The emperor had implored the People's Crusade to wait for the main army, which he had learned was coming. Peter, however, was unwilling to wait and set out with his army to pillage the countryside of Anatolia. The coming Prince's Crusade, as it was called, was the polar opposite of this chaos. A large, well-armed and equipped feudal army, led by prominent historical figures such as Raymond of Toulouse, Adhemar of Le Puy, Godfrey of Bouillon, and Baldwin of Boulogne. This much more formidable army was already on its way to the Byzantine capital, with nearly 100,000 of their own warriors. With an underling in charge of the People's Crusade, Peter the Hermit was back in Constantinople to secure supplies. While Peter was gone and unwilling to wait for reinforcements or the supplies that Peter was trying to procure for them, this underling led the People's Crusade into a near-total massacre. The Seljuk Turks lay in wait and ambushed the army, killing most of them. The Seljuks spared the women and children who surrendered, but the People's Crusade was over. The different hosts of the Prince's Crusade, however, arrived in Constantinople and began to mass together. After Alexios had extracted a pledge from the Crusader leadership that they would return any conquered Byzantine lands to his control, the emperor promised his support for their efforts. Ferrying the army over to Anatolia, he provisioned them as they prepared to march east. First came Nicaea, which the Crusaders put to siege on the 14th of May, 1097. The Seljuk Sultan of Rum, Kilij Arslan, busy fighting an internal conflict, rushed to the city and its defense. Arslan's capital contained his treasury and his family within its walls. He attacked the Crusaders on the 16th but withdrew, having vastly underestimated the substantial professional army that had come. He was likely expecting more of the People's Crusade level of resistance. The earlier, easier victory had lured Arslan into a false sense of security. With Alexios' aid, the Crusaders took Nicaea on the 18th of June in that year. The conquerors were not permitted to loot the city, as it was quickly reclaimed by Alexios, much to their frustration. This one battle was the shining example of Latin-Byzantine cooperation. This victory was a high watermark of their leadership, and it would go downhill from here on out. The Crusade split into two different, more easily manageable groups as they marched east. The first group, mainly consisting of the Normans, came under assault. Arslan gathered a far more formidable force and fought the Crusaders at Dorylaeum. Not expecting the arrival of the French contingent, Aslan fled with the sudden appearance of reinforcements. After reaching the Cilician gates, Baldwin and Tancred left the primary Crusader host and headed east into the Armenian lands. Baldwin, seeking his own domain, hoped for help from the Armenian Christians. Seizing towns and fighting several battles, Thoros, the Lord of Edessa, sent messengers to Baldwin in 1098, seeking aid to fight against local Seljuk Turks. Reaching Edessa, the Lord adopted Baldwin as his son and co-regent of the city. The locals, probably with Baldwin's insistence, began to conspire against Thoros. With riots breaking out, Baldwin did nothing as rioters murdered Thoros and his wife, leaving him in sole control of the city. Assuming the title of Count of Edessa, Baldwin had founded the first Crusader state. Alexios did not demand the return of the city despite having controlled it until its fall in 1087. Without Baldwin or Tancred, the Crusaders marched to the great Roman city of Antioch. This nearly impregnable fortress city of the east sat midway between Constantinople and Jerusalem. This siege, one of the most incredible and fascinating in history, was full of twists and turns. Beginning on the 20th of October 1097, it would see some of the greatest moments of the entire campaign. By January of 1098, the Crusaders had failed to take the city. With hunger and attrition taking hold, Crusaders expelled all of the women from their camp, believing that it had been the Crusaders' sinful nature that had caused God to abandon them. Rates of desertion were high during this phase of the campaign. During this period, it would also be relatively easy to have driven the Crusaders into the sea, but the near-constant infighting in the Muslim world had taken no real opposition to their presence. However, with Kerbuga, the Atbeg of Mosul, raising an army in Anatolia, Iraq, and Syria, the clock for the Crusaders began to count downwards. Having arranged its betrayal by an Armenian city commander, Bohemond promised to deliver the city to the Crusaders under the condition that it would be his after it had fallen. On the 2nd of June, true to his word, Antioch was betrayed into the Crusader hands. Christians within the city threw open the gates, and the siege came to a bloody climax. Muslims, Syrians, and many others were killed during this attack as the city fell. Even Christians were caught up in the chaos of the aftermath and murdered. Only 2 days later, Kerbuga's army arrived, and now the besiegers had become the besieged within the very walls that they had labored so hard to take. With the desertion of Stephen of Blois, he had taken word to the Byzantine emperor that the crusade was doomed, having learned of the siege and their forces by the Muslim army. He convinced Alexios that there was no point in sending aid to the beleaguered siege, and that the crusade was a lost cause. This inaction would prove disastrous in the relationship between the Latins and the Byzantines. From the 10th of June to the 14th, Kerbuga assaulted the city from dawn to dusk. When he failed, he set out to starve Antioch. On the 24th of June, the Crusaders sought terms and wished to surrender. Kerbuga was not in a charitable mood, understandably. His failure to accept these terms, however, was a dreadful mistake that would cost him dearly. So it was on the 28th of June that the Crusader army, starving and desperate, set out to fight, exiting the city for war. Hoping to destroy them in open battle, Kerbuga let the army fully deploy outside the city. The Crusaders then incredibly routed the Muslim army outside the walls of Antioch, a stunning victory snatched from the jaws of defeat. Feeling abandoned by Alexios, Bohemond declared himself Prince of Antioch and decided to keep the city and never return it to Byzantine control. Plague then swept through Antioch, killing many within its walls, leading to starvation, possibly cannibalism. In 1099, the Crusader army resumed its campaign and marched southward. As the army progressed, they hugged the Mediterranean coast. Each coastal city submitted individually and met little resistance while marching into the Holy Land. The Fatimids of Egypt had taken Jerusalem from the Seljuks the year before. The Fatimids attempted to make a deal with the Crusaders, promising the right of pilgrimage to the city if they halted their advance. They would not. The governor of Jerusalem expelled all Christians from the city and began poisoning the wells around the countryside. Reaching Tripoli, the emir of the city gave horses and support to the campaign, even promising to convert to Christianity if the Crusaders could defeat the Fatimids. On the 7th of June 1099, the Crusader army reached its goal, the great city of Jerusalem at long last. They wept at seeing the city, which had cost them so much to reach. With no water and little in the form of relief, the Crusaders realized quickly that the siege of the city would just be as deadly for them as it would be the besieged. The Fatimids of Egypt would send a relief army soon. They needed to capture the city quickly. The Crusade leadership understood that they needed to take the fortress by assault. Only 12,000 men and perhaps 1,500 cavalry were all that remained in the army. The first assault on the 13th of June met with failure. With the arrival of Genoese mariners on the 17th of June at Jaffa, the engineers they brought could now build siege engines from the frames of their ships. Fasting for 3 days and marching around the city barefoot in procession, following Jericho's biblical story, the Crusaders launched their final assault on the 13th of July, 1099. By the 15th, the last push began, and the Crusade took the city. With Jerusalem's fall, the orgy of murder that erupted within those walls was hard to describe. Nearly the entire non-Christian population was put to the sword by men of faith, consumed by the bloodlust of war. These men had done the impossible, traveled thousands of miles from their home deep into their enemies' lands and captured one of the most important cities of the world. And now they needed to keep it. On the 22nd of July, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was born. Godfrey was crowned king in August of that year. The Fatimid vizier had led a force of 20,000 to retake the city. The Crusaders halted the Fatimids outside of Ascalon. For the moment, the invading Christians had secured their conquests inside the Holy Land. With the creation of the 4 Crusader states, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the County of Tripoli, the Latins had established a strong foothold in the Holy Land. In the next installment of this series, Salah ad-Din, the great Muslim general, will do all he can to take it back. History will remember him as Saladin. Well, if you've enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to see more future content. Also comment below for any other major historical events that you'd like to see me cover. Thanks for watching.